Hello. This film is part of a series of conversations I'm having with academics from Lancaster University's Department of Politics, Philosophy and Religion. This department has a rich and celebrated history and study of religion, and these conversations are intended to showcase some of the research and expertise found there. You can find more details about the department and the courses they offer via the link below. My name is Benjamin Wood, and I'm the subject leader for religious studies at Haslingden High School, a large and proudly comprehensive school in Lancashire, where I've been teaching GCSE and A-levels since 2002. Some of these conversations will be linked to the GCSE and A-level courses, while others will focus more broadly on the study of religion and worldviews. The aim is to provide teachers of all key stages with knowledge that isn't just of interest, but can be of use in the classroom, perhaps by presenting new and contemporary thinkers, or providing new examples and data that can contribute to rich learning in our classrooms. I hope you find that this conversation is both useful and enjoyable. Hello, I'd like to welcome to this conversation Dr. Brian Black. Brian is a senior lecturer in the Department of Politics, Philosophy and Religion at Lancaster University. And Brian particularly specialises in the areas of Hinduism, Buddhism and Indian philosophy. Very good to see you, Brian. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Ben. Good to see you.
We're going to be focusing a couple of areas during this conversation, particularly looking at some key concepts that we find within Indian religions, within Indian philosophy, and looking at how some of the way that story is used, the way the narrative is used to communicate those concepts and what we can learn and what we need to understand in sort of understanding, in learning from those stories. So if we go to let's start with a really important concept, the concept of dharma. A very common concept taught across schools, primary schools, secondary schools, for students studying A-level will be studying dharma. It's a key concept. But we wanted to focus discussion by looking at some of the dialogues in the Mahabharata and how we might use those to understand the concept of dharma. So perhaps if you just perhaps start us off with the concept itself and what dharma is, and then we can move into looking at the dialogues in the Mahabharata.
Okay. Well, I mean, dharma, like so many concepts from, so many core concepts in non-Western religions it's very difficult to define. It simply doesn't correspond exactly to any particular word in English. It's often translated using a variety of different terms, from religion to law to justice to responsibility. And I think that first of all, it can mean all of those things, sometimes only a few of those things at a time, and sometimes seemingly all of those things at the same time. I think for me, one of the real benefits of reading the primary sources, the dialogues and the narratives from ancient India, where this term first appears, is that when we see dharma being talked about in the primary sources, we see that it's a contested term. So in other words, not only is it very difficult to translate, but in addition to that, it means that even within the tradition, people understand and have understood this term differently in different times and in different contexts. So, for example, it's very interesting to look at a text like the Mahabharata and to look at a conversation where two or more characters talk about dharma, because we can see that even though there are some overlapping understandings of the term, there are also ways in which one character might understand dharma in one particular way, and another character might be understanding it in a slightly different way. Just like a concept, a key concept in other religious traditions would be the same. But again, it's through the primary sources, I think, that we're really reminded that not only are these terms difficult to translate, but they were dynamic terms. It wasn't, they never had this static definition that everybody agreed upon, but they were these terms that people kept on coming back to again and again, and arguing about what they meant, arguing about what the implications of those meanings were, etc.
So might we argue then that perhaps rather than trying to simplify, translate, find a sort of equivalent concept, that actually may be better to avoid doing that and just, as you say, perhaps go to primary text, which that dynamism of that term, that perhaps lack of certainty about that term, maybe students should be grappling with that from the start, sort of, rather than maybe in simplifying, we're actually causing some confusion. Then would it be perhaps better just to start with the text, do you think?
I think so. Because I think that, one of the things is that reading primary sources can be a bit daunting for students and for teachers, because they're often quite difficult to understand. There are all sorts of layers of meaning. And I think that there's often a sense that you have to be a sort of expert to be able to understand what's going on. And it's sort of easier to teach alongside a textbook. But I think that one of the benefits of the primary sources is, first of all, these are the ways that Hindus and Buddhists have learned about their own traditions over the centuries. And because there are many layers of meaning, it also means that for so many of the primary sources, that it's never sort of too early to introduce them in the stage of learning about a tradition, because it's not like you're going to grasp every single facet of what's going on. One of the things that really sort of characterizes the traditions of Hinduism and Buddhism is how important stories are. And that a lot of the stories act as a sort of hook, that as much as there might be a whole lot of things going on that only the sort of greatest scholars fully understand, there's also a whole lot of things going on that are immediately accessible and immediately engaging, and kind of, grab you, make you want to be learning more. So I think that in that sense, rather than sort of putting off the primary sources as something that you only read at university or only the experts read, I think that they should really be introduced at a much earlier stage in the sort of religious education curriculum, just because you can always learn more, you can always add to your understanding of them. But it's a way, another way of looking at it, it's a way to let the tradition speak for itself. It's a way where you can be learning about Hinduism or Buddhism or other traditions through the words of the tradition itself, rather than being sort of simplified or translated or explained in, usually like in Western terms. Now, of course, I'm not saying like burn your textbooks, because, the textbooks can be immensely helpful to guide us through the primary sources, to help us get a sense of what's going on within them. But I think that the primary sources really can be introduced at a very early age. I mean, I remember when my son was in primary school, I went in, from the time he was in year 1, and again in year 2, and again in year 5, and gave talks about Hindu and Buddhist stories. And every time I went in, as the kids got older, I introduced a little bit more analysis and a little bit more sort of reflection on what was going on. But the stories themselves grabbed their attention from the very beginning. And so then when I would come back in the next year, they wanted to hear more and wanted to sort of take it that much level further.
Okay. So I think what be interesting to hear about perhaps some of these stories you might. Um, so we'll come back to the idea of reading text and maybe how we should approach that, because I think there's a point here about um, if we're sat in sort of in the West with our Western brains approaching a text from the East, are there things we should be um, thinking about as we do that? But on this concept of dharma, then, do you want to introduce us to, if we were studying the concept of dharma, how we might use some of the dialogue in the Mahabharata
Okay,
as a
well,
way of understanding that?
two stories come to mind. And these are stories that I've explored both in my own research and in my teaching. And so I can say firsthand that they do work in the classroom, and not only in university classrooms. These are stories I've talked about when I visited schools across Britain, certainly at A level, sometimes at GCSE level as well. And one story is one that I think most teachers will already be familiar with, and that is the story of the Bhagavad Gita. The Bhagavad Gita is, for those who aren't already aware, is actually an episode within the Mahabharata. And the sort of the Bhagavad Gita episode begins when there's this prince by the name of Arjuna who is on a battlefield. He's about to begin fighting in this massive war. And at the moment he's about to start fighting, he starts having misgivings. He's completely, in a sense, overwhelmed emotionally with this feeling um, of sort of foreboding that and then the Bhagavad Gita consists of his charioteer, who's also his cousin, who's also God, Krishna, basically convincing Arjuna to fight in this battle. Now, I'm sure a lot of people are already familiar with this story, but I think one of the things that this story really sets up at the very beginning is a dilemma within an understanding of Dharma. And on the one hand, um, Arjuna feels that he should fight because he's a warrior. It is his responsibility to not only fight in wars, but to protect his family, and his family's under threat. And so there's this sense that, that he'd be living up to his responsibility by fighting. But then on the other hand, um, because it's a civil war and that his family is split right down the middle, his cousins as well as some elder members of his family, including his grandfather, as well as his teacher, are all fighting on the other side. And the sort of obligation to one's elders and teachers is also something extremely important within the concept of Dharma.
Okay.
And so, in other words, there's a sort of classic dilemma with, if he fights, he's going to be violating some aspects of Dharma. If he doesn't fight, he'll be violating
Mm,
other aspects of
yeah.
Dharma. So the question is, what should he do? But I think that by framing this whole episode within a dilemma about Dharma, we learn a lot about Dharma. We learn a lot about, the sort of wide range of understandings it can have, as well as some of the tensions within the concept itself. And those sort of tensions that we learn about through this episode, I think, they just go so much further than any, definition of the term could ever give us. The other thing too is not just looking at like the reasons, the sort of background reason, but the arguments given. What does Arjuna say as to why he shouldn't fight? What does Krishna say about what he should fight? I mean, why he should fight. And so, in a sense, we have two characters, not only taking these different positions, but putting forth, reasons why their position is correct. The other thing, though, that's really interesting about this whole episode, and this is something that not very many people concentrate on, is on the one hand, this dilemma is solved, or at least seemingly so, because Arjuna does go out and fight. He listens to Krishna, he follows Krishna's advice, and he goes out and fights. But if you look at the Bhagavad Gita within the wider context of the Mahabharata, you'll see that there are other subsequent dialogues between Arjuna and Krishna, ones in which Krishna says slightly different things. And
Okay.
there's this one in particular called the Anu Gita, which is translated as like the After Gita, in which Krishna gives a teaching that almost contradicts some of the most important things he says in the Bhagavad Gita. And so again, what we see is that even though we know what happens as a result of this dialogue, we're still left with the question as to, well, so does that mean that was the right thing to do?
Yeah.
Does that mean
Okay.
that that's what dharma is? And I think that the Mahabharata as a text is particularly interesting that way, is that there's almost always another point of view. There's never a question that is completely and utterly solved. And I think that one of the things that's interesting about that, when so many of the questions are about core religious ideas, we see that, no understanding is complete. There's always another layer of understanding.
Yeah.
There's always another perspective to look at. There's always, another layer of meaning. And I think that that sort of approach to some of the core ideas of a particular religion is a very interesting one, again, because it's not looking for, oh, what do Hindus believe? Oh, what does dharma mean? Oh, okay, let's take that box. Now we know what dharma means. We
Yeah.
see that these big questions are ones that religious people in any tradition are bringing with them throughout their lives. And as they go out and they experience different things, they're always trying to relate their own experiences back to their sort of core understandings of the world. And their core understandings of the world often changes through time as
Yeah.
they have different experiences and have to make different choices, etc. And so I think the Bhagavad Gita is a really wonderful way to to explore that. And another one of my
Could I just
favorite.
can I
Oh
just
yeah.
interrupt there, because I'll come to that second story, but
Yeah.
I'm reflecting on my own practice here, and I've used that story before in class. Now, the way I think I've taught it, and I think if I'm good at it, I've probably not done it as well as I could have done, because I think in the way I've taught it in the past, I've presented Arjuna's uh, misgivings, as it were, as Arjuna not understanding what his dharma was, and as it were, it's Krishna that's correcting him. You're suggesting that Arjuna's initial, shall we say, understanding of dharma is a understanding of dharma. It's not that he was wrong; it's that dharma can be understood in different ways. Is that? Am I
That's
characterizing that
absolutely
correctly?
what I'm saying. That's absolutely what I'm saying.
Right.
However, I'm not going to say that you were teaching it incorrectly, because the way that you're teaching is exactly how a lot of people do understand the Bhagavad Gita. I certainly don't want to claim that I'm the only one who really knows
Yeah.
what's
Yeah.
going on
Yeah.
here, or that my teaching is a better one. But I think teaching the Bhagavad Gita as an episode within the Mahabharata, we do see that that is a tendency within the Mahabharata to leave those questions unresolved.
Right.
And I've in my recent book, I go into quite a detailed analysis of the Bhagavad Gita, basically making that argument that things are not as resolved as they seem. Um, I'm happy for people to disagree,
Yeah.
but I do think that that's a worthwhile interpretation to
But
take
it
as
would
well.
certainly be worth, perhaps in teaching that again next time, me exploring a little bit more Arjuna's understanding and why he think as a legitimate idea of what dharma means. So if we're exploring the concept of dharma, both Arjuna and Krishna are bringing to that conversation things of value.
Absolutely. I mean,
Yeah.
another one of my arguments there is that Arjuna plays a really important role in directing the conversation. We can say that that's Krishna's greatest teaching moment, and that's his most sort of in-depth and most articulate expression of himself as the divine. But one of the reasons why he expresses himself in that way is because of the questions that
Okay.
Arjuna asks him.
Yeah.
And I think that also tells us something really important about what kind of God that Krishna is and what kind of relationship humans can have with Krishna as a God. And that a lot of the interlocutors with Krishna in the Mahabharata as a whole are people who question him. Like Arjuna not only, at one point he says, please teach me, but then at other moments he questions
Right.
Krishna's argument. He accuses Krishna of contradicting himself. And one could argue then that Krishna delivers a higher teaching, but one of the reasons that he delivers that teaching is because of the very questions that Arjuna asks.
Yeah.
And so, it's because of the sort of provocation that Arjuna gives him that Krishna is able to give, the type of teaching that he does.
Okay. You were going to mention a second
Oh yeah,
story.
well, another one of my favorite stories is the one of Bhishma. Bhishma is a very important character in the Mahabharata. In a way, he's the grandfather of Arjuna, the one I mentioned earlier that Arjuna would have to fight in the Bhagavad Gita on the battlefield. And in fact, he does end up fighting him, and it's Arjuna who ends up killing Bhishma.
Right.
And so his worst fears come true, which also kind of goes back and adds some sort of credence to his reservations in the first place, because exactly the things that he's concerned about end up happening. But Bhishma, when he was a much younger man, way before Arjuna was born, he was supposed to be the next king. He was the crown prince. But because of a long, complicated reason, he ended up making this vow of celibacy. And basically that meant that he would never become king, and nor would he ever have any offspring to claim the kingship. Now, what's really interesting about his story, again, is that several times through the Mahabharata, he's challenged as to whether this vow was a good thing and whether he should keep it. Because as the story moves on, he has the chance to save the family on numerous occasions by renouncing his vow and coming back and being king. And every time he refuses to do so. Now, on these occasions, even though he constantly makes arguments to defend taking the vow, and he always does so in terms of dharma, he makes different arguments along the way.
Right.
So we also see this character who is looking back on his past actions and justifying them, making sense of them differently as he gets older and as his circumstances change. And similarly, every time he's asked to give up his vows, his interlocutor also make argument based on dharma. And again, on the one hand, we know that he doesn't give up his vow, and and so on one level, that's the end of the story. But on the other hand, we see that there are a number of very legitimate reasons why he might give up his vow, but chooses not to. Again, all articulated in terms of the concept of dharma. So in a sense, through the character of Krishna, we see this almost sort of narrative long exploration of this concept of dharma in relation to his vows. And again, it's a wonderful way to sort of explore a number of the possible meanings, but also about what's really important to the Mahabharata, about how the reasons one gives are often very situational and contextual, that people are constantly reevaluating their own actions, making sense of their own actions in relation to their religious tradition in different ways as their circumstances change.
So it certainly seems there's a strong relational aspect to Dharma. The fact that it's explored through relationship and discussion and dialogue, but that sense of, as you were just saying, of it's very situational and requires exploration within any given situation as to what
Yeah,
what Dharma
I would
is.
agree
Yeah.
with that. I think that that's one of the ways, and one of the most important points that really comes through reading the Mahabharata. Reading the Mahabharata is a way to understand Dharma.
Yeah.
There are other contexts where you might, learn about Dharma that aren't quite, that don't emphasize its sort of situatedness and, it being as contextual. But certainly in this text, it really does. And again, it makes it this really dynamic concept. That doesn't mean it can mean anything. It doesn't mean that everybody's perspective is legitimate to everybody else's, but it does show that it's a dynamic concept.
Yeah. Okay. So if I just broaden out a little bit, so we've talked about dialogue here, and you've kind of emphasized the importance of the dialogue, and the importance of kind of robust dialogue, actually, I think, in these situations. So when approaching reading dialogue you're talking the Mahabharata particularly, are there things that we ought to be bearing in mind? Are there things we should be conscious of when approaching these? And part of that might be because, as a Western mind taken into an Eastern text, are there things that we should, put the forefront of our mind when reading these, so we make sure that we're getting the most from them?
I don't think there's any sort of particular rule book or method. I do think that so for example, if you're teaching the Bhagavad Gita, there are a lot of very good translations of the Bhagavad Gita with good introductions. And it is important to sort of read around to get a sense of how it's been interpreted, and how scholars and insiders have sort of justified why they've read things in the way that they have. So on the one hand, I think whether you're, with any text, there are multiple interpretations, but that doesn't mean that every interpretation is a good one. Similarly, to venture further with the Mahabharata is a difficult text to teach because it's so large, it's so big, it's hard to know where to start. But on the other hand, it's never been as accessible as it is now because there's so many versions. There's podcasts available for free that you can listen to. There's comic books. When I would go in and talk to my son's class, I brought in a bunch of comic books of the Mahabharata. And the teacher told me later that almost every single kid in the class at one time took one of those comic books home just to look at it a little bit more closely. There's the Hindi version with subtitles on YouTube. There isn't one complete translation in English that's been made in the last 100 years that's particularly accessible, but there are number of episodes that are very accessible. That are, so I think that, my one advice, don't try to teach the whole thing. And the other thing is that one of the things I do with some of my students when I don't want to get into the whole text and all the issues of the text is to choose, there are a number of self-contained episodes. There are a number of stories within the text that you don't need to know the sort of wider story to get a lot out of.
Yeah. Just one thought, I suppose, maybe the nature of dialogue, or is that maybe are we meant to identify with a particular character? So if you take the story of Arjuna and Krishna, are we meant to identify with Arjuna, or can we sort of place ourselves in Krishna's position as well? Is Is that the nature of the dialogue, that we can put ourselves into that dialogue, as it were, and explore it internally almost?
I mean, I think that's a really good question. I mean, one of the things, just to back up a little bit to how we were starting off this conversation, I mean, I think that the relationship between form and content is extremely important. And especially when we're looking at ancient texts, and perhaps also particularly when we're looking at texts from India. I mean, I'm sure that that might be true of other places in the world, but since I don't research
Yeah.
those texts myself, I don't want to come down on that one too hard. But if a text is composed in a particular style, not only is should should we see that style as part of the teaching, should we pay attention to the style, but we should be thinking that there's a reason why that style is used
Yeah.
and perhaps not another style. However, you know, dialogue. So let's talk about dialogue for a second. Dialogue is a style that we see in a lot of ancient Indian sources, sometimes almost sort of on its own, or sometimes within a story, within a larger narrative. But just because we know that form and content is important, just because we know that dialogue is an important literary style, doesn't mean that dialogue is always doing the same thing. It doesn't
Right.
mean that there's three steps on reading a
Mm.
dialogue. There
Yeah.
aren't. And so, for example, I've researched and taught about the use of dialogue in the Upanishads, and I've also done research and taught about the use of dialogue within the Mahabharata. Now, there's some overlapping features of dialogue, to be sure, but there are also some different ways in which this genre is being used. And so it's important to, to not think that just because dialogue is being
Yeah.
used, that necessarily, these things are happening within the text. So to go back to your point, like within the Mahabharata, like I think it can actually change from one episode to the next, because there's often a narrative voice that is that's recounting the dialogue. Sometimes the narrative voice is really present. Sometimes the narrative voice is siding with one of the interlocutors over another.
Right.
So sometimes there's sort of cues within the text of whose point of view that maybe you should be taking more seriously or not. Sometimes there isn't. um, I think that when it comes to the Bhagavad Gita, I think that it's that on some level Arjuna is meant to be a character that we can relate to. Even though there's some sort of aspects of him as sort of a chosen one to be talking to Krishna, there are unique features of Arjuna that none of us have in common with Arjuna. There are also other features of Arjuna where he's sort of an everyman or an every person. And so in that way, you know, through Arjuna, we can almost have a conversation with the divine.
Mm.
And so I think in the Bhagavad Gita, I think that we're definitely meant to be sort of seeing things more through the eyes of Arjuna than through Krishna.
Yeah.
Even though there might be the divine in everybody, we're not the divine, in the way that Krishna is. However, I think that other dialogues are really, meant to be quite balanced between the two interlocutors, and we're really left at the end wondering who's right, who's wrong, who should we side with, who had the better argument. And as I said, though, oftentimes there's sort of cues within the narrative voice of the text as to how we should be thinking about those sorts of questions.
Yeah, I think it's an important point you make about this sort of form and content. I think that's something to be very aware of. I do try and communicate with my students whenever, particularly in primary text. I guess I can think of plenty of examples with the Gospels, for example, where I'm sort of getting this, I put position, well, why are we being told this? Or with the writings of St. Paul in some of my little students again, why are we being told this? Why St. Paul empty? So I guess is that point about reading any kind of literature, I guess, is that why has the author decided to include this? And maybe why they decided not to include something else? Why have they decided to
Mm,
omit something? What's is understanding that kind of that level of analysis? Yeah. So if we move on to consider stories that I think lots of our teachers will be very familiar with about the life of the Buddha.
yes.
Um, Again, it's not an area I'm an expert in at all, but my understanding is that there isn't, as it were, um, an agreed upon correct version of the life of the Buddha. There are many versions. And I'm wondering perhaps if you can explore that sense of if we're approaching these stories, how we ought to do, bearing in mind there are different versions and what those different versions might be trying to communicate.
Yeah, I mean, that was a nice segue into that question
Thank you.
but also to end with, you know, you're mentioning the Gospels, because I think that, you know, here with the Synoptic Gospels, you know, we have three stories of more or less the same thing, but different versions. All of them have things that are in the others, but then all of them have aspects of them that are make them unique to the others. And so we really learn a lot by reading them together, to compare them with each other, look for the similarities and look for the differences. I think that just one thing more about the Mahabharata, or about Hindu stories more generally, is that there are a lot of versions of the same stories. So, you know, within the Mahabharata, there are oftentimes, you know, a particular episode that occurs on many occasions. Also, like the story of the Ramayana, not only is a separate text, but there's a shorter version of it that
Right.
appears in the Mahabharata.
Okay.
And I think that those are really fun and kind of fruitful stories to teach, because they're very, you know, I think students can really immediately start to be thinking in terms of similarities and differences and possible reasons for why things are there or not there, different audiences that might, you know, that the author might have in mind, etc. So moving on now to the story of the Buddha. I mean, I think this is such an interesting example, because, you know, I think that if we think about most students in Britain who have learned about Buddhism in a school environment for the first time, chances are they first hear about Buddhism through the life story of the Buddha. Or even if that's not the very first lesson, you know, almost
Mm.
everybody has heard that story who's
Yeah.
learning about Buddhism. And, you know, we hear the story of this young man who was born into extreme wealth and was the crown prince, but decided to give it all up to, you know, basically to seek the truth, to seek a more meaningful life. He goes around to a bunch of teachers, and he's not satisfied with their teaching. So he decided that he's going to find this truth on his own. He's going to sit under this tree and meditate until this sort of the insight that he's looking for comes to him. It does, and then he goes around and shares this insight with his followers the rest of his life. Now, every detail of the very condensed version of the story that I just told you is in an ancient source. So it's not like this story is completely made up. But the way that I've just told this story is a very secular version of the story of the Buddha. And the way that I've just told it, though, I think is also characteristic of how you're more likely to encounter that story, not only in a British classroom, but in the British textbook,
Mm.
in any textbook, in the West. And in a sense, we might think that one of the reasons why Buddhism is so popular in the West is because it begins with this very secularized version of
Right.
the story, a
Yeah.
story that really began in Sri Lanka in the late 19th century, with the input of some pretty influential Westerners, um,
Okay.
and who were part of the Theosophical Society. And so in that way, I think it's very important when we think about the story of the Buddha to go back and think, well, what do the Buddhist sources say about this story? And that's really fascinating, because even though some of the same details that we all know and are familiar with are there, some really interesting other details are there that most, I think, modern Western students and teachers would be pretty surprised to
Right.
see. So one version is called the Mahapadana Sutta. This is a sutta that appears as part of the Digha Nikaya. It's part of the Pali Canon, and it's one of the oldest kind of still existing stories of the Buddha that we have. And in this story, the Buddha is not presented as this sort of unique human individual, but rather he's presented as the enlightened one of this particular eon, of this
Right.
particular sort of life cycle. And he's within a lineage of 7 other Buddhas, each one being the enlightened one of their eon.
Right.
So already he's not a historical figure, he's a cosmological figure.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, we get all of these details: born a crown prince, went out to seek the truth on his own, meditated under the Bodhi tree, taught at the deer park for his first teaching, had his followers. But these details are ones that are shared by each of these Buddhas that he's in the lineage with.
Mm.
And so in that sense, again, these aren't, it's not this sort of existential story about this one human who wanted to sort of have a
Yeah.
deeper understanding of their life, but rather it's part of this sort of cosmological formula that that we know that this Buddha is who he claims to be. And we know that his enlightenment and his knowledge is an enlightened knowledge that he claims it to be, because it fits into this greater cosmological pattern.
Right.
And it's interesting that in each of those presentations of the Buddha story, in each eon, the Buddha gives the same teachings. His enlightenment experience is the insight into dependent origination. His first teaching is the Four Noble Truths. His second teaching is the 3 marks of existence. But again, it's not because this really brilliant, individual had this deep insight, but he's tapping into this
Right.
cosmological
Yeah.
knowledge. So it really presents things quite
Mm.
differently, even though a lot of the details are the same. And another early version of the life of the Buddha is also in the Digha Nikaya. This is in a sutta called the Mahaparinibbana Sutta. This is the sutta that details the final days of the Buddha. So again, even though this is a sort of biographical story, it's different because it doesn't start with his birth. It doesn't start with his upbringing. It doesn't talk about how he became the Buddha. Rather, almost like the Gospel of Mark or something, it just sort of starts
The
like
start.
right
Yeah. Yeah.
before
Yeah.
he's about to die. And we sort of see the final days of the Buddha. And in this one, there's a really interesting contrast, because one of the things that this version of the story does is that it highlights his supernatural capabilities. He's able to see things and hear things from very far away. And these are details that we don't tend to find in most modern secular versions of the Buddha story. But part of his, part of the implications of his Buddhahood are all these sort of extraordinary or extrasensory powers, like the ability to remember past lives, the ability to transport himself. Not all of these things come up in this sutta, but it
Right.
is interesting
Yeah.
that the Buddha is very much associated with these supernatural powers in an ancient Indian context. So this sutta does emphasize at least some of those things, but it also, at the same time, emphasizes his vulnerability, is that we see the Buddha as an old man. We see the Buddha who, who ends up dying, who ends up, as approaching his death, ends up being frail and sickly. And so it's very interesting that it both sort of, both of these sides, both the sort of extra humanness of his character, but also the vulnerability of his character, neither of which we tend to see in modern versions, are both sort of emphasized in this story. And if we have time, I'll just bring up one
Yeah.
more
Yeah.
version that I think is a really interesting one. And this is a text. It's called the Buddha Charita, and it wasn't a Buddhist text. In other words, it wasn't canonical. It wasn't composed by monks and nuns within the Buddhist community. It was composed around 200 in the Common Era by a famous Sanskrit playwright named Ashvaghosha, who many people think of as probably a convert to Buddhism. And in a sense, this is more likely. I mean, it's hard, we'll never fully know the answer to this, but it's more likely that this was probably the most popularized version of the
Right.
story of the Buddha in an ancient Indian context. Here, again, some of the same details we see in the modern version, some of the same details that we see in the Mahabharata Sutta, but the audience here is more of a Hindu audience. And so one of the things that comes out in the Buddhist character is his similarity with the Hindu hero Rama. So there's all
Okay.
sorts of sort of parallels between the Buddha and Rama. And so again, we see, how the sort of audience that an author has in mind when they're telling the Buddhist story has a big influence on how this story is told, what things are emphasized, etc. Again, one of the things that this story reminds us of is the birth of the Buddha was predicted. It was predicted by Brahmins. Another detail that appears in a number of these ancient versions is that after the Buddha becomes enlightened, he initially doesn't want to teach, but is only convinced by the god Brahma to teach. And so, in other words, even though the Buddha, strictly speaking, isn't depicted as a god, there are a number of deities within the story of the
Right.
Buddha in
Yeah.
almost every ancient version. And again, they tend to be sort of,
Mm.
left out of the modern accounts. And I've done this with students at Lancaster, as well as in some of the times that I visited schools. And I found that just getting students to compare these different versions, to talk about, which ones they like, which ones they don't like, which details are left out, and which ones are included, that is a really sort of fruitful exercise in sort of getting a better understanding of how the Buddha was understood in his own times and how he, is understood within his own tradition.
I mean, that's very interesting. Lots of that's very completely new to me. That sense of, um, but it fits into that bit of understanding the nature of the text or the audience or the author, and seeing what is being presented here. And I can certainly see that. I think you get some more interesting learning than just say, let's learn the story of the Buddha. And if we start to explore, around that sort of the kind of the basic narrative that we can work around, that all these texts seem to to include, but exploring the differences and similarities in these texts. Well, to me, that sounds to me interesting, because we're exploring a character then, the Buddha. We're actually learning more about him, because he seems to, well, it becomes more rounded, doesn't it, as a character? Of
Yeah,
course, the
no,
different
he
stories
does.
about the same person are going to emphasize different things, and therefore my understanding of this person is embellished by seeing that there are different accounts of his life, and why people might emphasize certain things over other things. That doesn't seem to me a difficult thing to do. I mean, there are, as you said before, there are lots of layers of analysis you can get into, but appreciating that we've got this person, but there are different ways of understanding his life, or different ways of talking about his life. That's some richer learning than just, I know a story, as it happens to be, of the Buddha, rather than the story of the Buddha.
And I think that it really kind of prompts students to become engaged with the story. Rather, here's a story, learn the details, that's it. Once you're comparing and contrasting, you find that students immediately become sort of invested in the process. They start to prefer one story more than
Right.
another, or they like one detail in particular, and they're a little bit disappointed that it's not in another version, etc. And I think that once you get that sense of investment into the material, that's when real learning starts to take place. People have a stake in that somewhere. They want it to be one way rather than another way, or they're really wondering why it's this way rather than another way, etc. Another thing, though, that I can't help but want to bring up too is that it's really Westerners that put such importance on the story of the Buddha.
Right.
Most in an ancient Indian context, Buddhists were much more likely to be telling other stories rather
Okay.
than the stories of the Buddha's own life. And if you see, like, in sort of the most ancient examples of Buddhist kind of painting and architecture and reliefs, you see that it's all of these other wonderful stories that often captured people's imagination, not just the one about the Buddha's life story. Now, a lot of these stories are collected, and in are kind of brought together in different collections and are called jatakas. Not all Buddhist stories are called jatakas, but one particular type of story is called a jataka, and that means it was the former life of the Buddha. But
Right.
one of the things, though, is that oftentimes that's just sort of a frame. It's not really about the Buddha.
Okay.
It's a way of bringing in a popular story and sort of making it a Buddhist story. But what's interesting about that is that, as I said, that first of all, these are the stories that are most likely capturing the imagination of Buddhists themselves. A lot of important Buddhist concepts, like the importance of giving, the importance of sacrifice, for example, ones that tend not to be as much in our textbook as important Buddhist values. These are the things emphasized in these stories. And it's another great way to sort of get into the Buddhist tradition, to be reminded that not everything is about the Buddha in Buddhist stories, and that there are other people, other characters that sort of populate this Buddhist world and play a pretty important role in conveying some of its core teachings.
Thank you, Brian. That's really interesting, and I think that sense of how story can be used, and um, I mean, not only as a way of exploring text, but sort of understanding that stories have boundaries and limits. They can tell you some things, but they're also not telling you other things, and sort of, yeah, there are other stories over there. So I think that idea that, yeah, there are lots of other stories, and be interesting. I'd be interested in looking at, say, maybe ancient Buddhist architecture, and saying, well, actually, why aren't we seeing perhaps lots of depictions of the life of the Buddha? That tells us something, doesn't it, about what it is we're studying. So, take it. We've learned this story and we've explored this story, but then we also noticed that it isn't the only story, and then maybe that. So it kind of really opens up lots of avenues of exploration. So, thank you for your thoughts and your ideas here. I think that's really interesting to hear all that. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Ben. And just probably one thing worth reminding everybody is that there's going to be some sort of document to accompany this interview with a list of all the different stories that I've referred to throughout.
Yeah, we'll make sure all that is available for everybody to look.
Yeah.
Thank you very much, Brian.
All right. Thank you, Ben.